Imagine waking up in a hospital bed, your service dog pressed against your chest, acting as your guardian. Now, imagine waking up hours later in a cold, windowless concrete cell, only to find that same dog, your best friend, blocking the exit, teeth bared, growling with a ferocity that chills your blood. This is the story of Francis Ward, a man who realized his savior was actually his jailer. Francis Ward lived a life defined by fragile health. His neurological condition was unpredictable, often leading to sudden, debilitating seizures. His only tether to reality was Willy, a golden retriever trained to detect the onset of these episodes. Willy wasn't just a pet, he was a lifeline. He provided warmth, stability, and protection. Alongside him was Brittany Richardson, the dedicated handler who had trained Willy from a puppy. Brittany was the saintly figure in Francis's life, managing his medicine, his schedule, and his training. She constantly told Francis that the outside world was too dangerous for someone with his condition. Francis believed her because he had seen Willy save his life a dozen times. In the quiet safety of his apartment, Francis felt untouchable. He assumed this dynamic would last forever. But the closer you pull someone into your circle, the easier it is to trap them there. The days blurred into a cycle of medical appointments, training sessions, and quiet nights. Brittany was always there, adjusting the sensors or tweaking Willy's training protocol. She told Francis that his condition was worsening and that Willy needed to be with him 24/7 to monitor his brain waves. Francis complied, feeling a sense of deep gratitude. He stopped leaving the house. He stopped calling his family. The outside world began to feel like a distant, chaotic memory. Brittany subtly reinforced this, painting the world as a place where Francis would surely die without Willy's constant watch. Francis trusted her implicitly. He was the perfect patient, compliant, and isolated. Yet, there were moments, faint, nagging thoughts that something felt rehearsed. The way Willy would look at him when he tried to move toward the door, or the way Brittany would quickly steer the conversation back to his vulnerability. He was being molded into a prisoner, but he was too distracted by his own fragile health to notice the bars closing in. The evening started like any other. Francis felt the familiar, terrifying haze of an incoming seizure. He cried out for Willy, and the dog was there instantly, pawing at his chest, whining with an intensity that felt frantic. Brittany rushed into the room, telling Francis to breathe and let Willy guide him. The last thing Francis remembered was the golden fur against his cheek and the rhythmic pressure of Willy's nose against his heart. He felt safe. He felt taken care of. He expected to wake up in his bed, with Brittany nearby and the soft light of his lamp. But when he finally opened his eyes, the light was wrong. It was cold, harsh, and static. He wasn't in his bedroom. He wasn't in his apartment. He was in a place that smelled of antiseptic and damp concrete, a room without windows. The silence was heavy. Where was Brittany? Where was the comfort of his home? As his vision cleared, he saw the door, but blocking it was a familiar silhouette. It was Willy, and Willy was staring at him. The room was a sterile nightmare. Tiled walls, a flickering fluorescent light, and no way out. It looked less like a medical ward and more like a high-security holding cell. Francis tried to stand, his legs weak, his head spinning. As he moved, Willy shifted. The golden retriever didn't wag his tail. He didn't offer the gentle nuzzle Francis had grown to love. Instead, the dog lowered his head and let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Francis froze. "Willy? What's wrong, boy?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The dog didn't respond. He simply paced the small space between Francis and the metal door, his eyes locked onto Francis with a predatory focus. It was as if the dog were waiting for a command. Francis scanned the room for a phone, a buzzer, anything, but found nothing. He realized with a jolt of pure terror that he was trapped in a box. And the only creature he had ever trusted to save him was the one currently keeping him prisoner. Francis crawled toward the corner of the room, keeping his distance from the growling dog. He bumped into a metal cart that had been overturned. Files, medical charts, and strange, technical diagrams were scattered across the floor. He grabbed a handful of the papers, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped them. The documents were dated. Some were from months ago, logs of his seizures, logs of his recovery. But there was no medical jargon about his condition. Instead, the headers were chillingly specific: behavioral anchor conditioning, dependency reinforcement, and containment protocol. His heart hammered against his ribs. These weren't his medical records. They were an observation log. The room, the isolation, the dog. None of this was to help him. It was a study. He was the subject. Francis looked up, expecting the door to open, but all he saw was Willy, who had stopped growling and was now watching him with an eerie, detached intelligence. The Guardian hadn't just changed. The Guardian had been manufactured. The documents on the floor laid out the horrifying truth. The seizures? They weren't natural. The logs detailed how a specific, high-frequency sound, likely emitted from the collar Willy wore, was used to trigger the medical episodes. The dog wasn't detecting the seizures. He was causing them. Every time Francis had felt saved, he was actually being incapacitated by his own dog. He looked at the next page, which detailed the reinforcement schedule. It explained that by making Francis believe he was dying without Willy, they could ensure his total compliance. Brittany hadn't been his savior. She was his architect. She had constructed a reality where he was entirely dependent on a dog that functioned as a remote-controlled leash. The betrayal hit Francis like a physical blow. He wasn't a patient being treated. He was a lab rat being conditioned. The warmth he had felt from Willy was just a tactic. The protection was just a cage. He had loved his captor, and he had relied on his jailer. Francis couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, grabbing a heavy metal clipboard from the floor to defend himself. "I'm leaving," he yelled, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. He charged toward the door. Instantly, Willy lunged. It wasn't the play bite of a puppy or the warning of a protective dog. It was a calculated, vicious strike. Willy latched onto the sleeve of Francis's shirt, pulling him down to the floor with incredible force. Francis scrambled back, kicking at the dog, but Willy was relentless. The dog wasn't barking. He was silent, focused, and terrifyingly efficient. This was the training Brittany had been perfecting for months. Willy didn't care about Francis. He cared about the directive. The dog stood over him, baring his teeth, the growl now a constant, threatening hum. Francis realized that if he tried to stand again, Willy wouldn't hesitate. He was pinned in his own prison by his best friend. Francis lay on the cold floor, chest heaving. He stared into Willy's eyes, searching for a spark of the dog he used to know, but there was nothing. It was just a machine of flesh and blood. Then he heard it, the faint click of a lock. The heavy steel door creaked open. Brittany Richardson stood in the doorway, wearing a white lab coat, holding a tablet in her hand. She didn't look worried. She looked like a scientist checking on a successful experiment. "Subject 402 is awake," she noted calmly into the tablet, not even glancing at Francis. She looked down at the dog. "Good work, Willy. Return to post." Instantly, the dog let go of Francis's shirt and sat down by the door, wagging his tail for Brittany. The betrayal was complete. Francis wasn't a person to them. He was a variable, a data point, and the dog he loved was nothing more than a tool of the state. Brittany walked into the room, closing the door behind her. She didn't offer excuses. She didn't pretend to be his friend. She just looked at him with cold, clinical indifference. "You were doing so well, Francis," she said, tapping her screen. "The isolation was supposed to last another 3 months. But you got curious." She turned to Willy and gave a sharp hand signal. Willy stood and moved toward Francis, pressing his weight against him, forcing him to lie back down. "Your health is failing, Francis," she said, her voice devoid of empathy. "The conditioning has left your nervous system fragile. You need the dog. You need me." She turned to leave, but before she exited, she looked back. "Don't try it again." Willy has been taught that any movement toward the door is a threat. The door slammed shut, the lock clicked, and the lights dimmed. Francis was alone with his jailer. He realized he wasn't just in a room. He was in a loop, and there was no way out. What would you do if the one creature you trusted with your life turned out to be your biggest threat? Is there any way for Francis to break his conditioning, or is he trapped forever? I genuinely want to know. What would be your first move if you woke up in that room? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, hit that like button and subscribe to Mr. Brayn Tales. We have so many more dark mysteries and twisted stories coming your way. Don't miss the next one. You might regret it.